Dust sifted from Kurt Voss's cropped hair as he stepped onto the post-exchange floor at Fort Lewis, Washington, August 28, 1944. The boards were waxed to a quiet shine, the air salted with creosote from new fence posts and that metallic chill that only a compressor makes. A fan clicked once, twice, 3 times every circle, a drummer keeping time for a nation that measured even comfort with a clock. He was 15, a former Luftwaffe Flakhelfer whose hands still remembered the weight of a 20-round box for a 2-centimetre Flak 38. Now his fingers hovered between a sweating Coca-Cola and a paper cup crowned with a curl of vanilla. Mabel Hart, Red Cross pin bright on her blouse, said it like an order softly given, "Kid, take both." He hesitated, feeling the old drill sergeant in his head say, "Scarcity is virtue, hardness is victory." The MP by the door pretended not to watch, leather creaking as he shifted. On the bulletin board, Geneva rules were posted in German and English, cool as law. Equal rations with American soldiers, access to the canteen, pay credit for work details. He read them twice. It sounded like propaganda printed too plainly to be false. He set his camp script, chits earned for labour he had not yet done, on the counter. The register bell chimed, the small triumphant note of procedure. Mabel slipped him both without ceremony. The cone was cold through the wax paper. The Coke fizzed like static on a field telephone. The first taste hurt his teeth, and some other part of him that had forgotten sweetness existed. The camp outside ran like a metronome, barracks in rows, water points numbered, infirmary white as a chapel. He had known order in Germany. He had never known order that fed people this way. Boys from the Ruhr watched him in the PX glass, unsure whether to be ashamed or relieved. Karl, birth year 1929 stamped on his paybook, lifted his chin. Kurt let him sip. They had learned to count everything, shells, minutes, the last square of bread, but no one had trained them to count comfort. Yet here, everything was counted so that sweetness might arrive on time and at temperature. The intake had been as mercilessly clean as a factory, medical check, delousing powder, blankets with the smell of lye and storage. A sergeant explained in deliberate German the work details and the 50-cent daily credit common for unskilled labour. At first it sounded like a test. Later it sounded like rails. In the back room, metal lines sang softly. The compressor hissed and clunked on schedule. Someone had decided that if ice cream were to be offered, it would be offered properly, because that is what a procedure is. Mercy engineered. He ate slower, listening to the fan's 3 clicks, the corporal's measured breathing, the glass rattle in the cone rack. Rhythm had once meant aligning tracers on an incoming bomber. Now it timed the space between licks. Prices on a clipboard, 5 cents, 10 cents, looked like a tiny table of fire for happiness. Karl whispered a rumour, more than 500 camps like this across the United States, dots spread from pine forests to corn. Kurt swallowed and tasted milk and distance. An ocean of camps was hard to see. An ocean of cows was easier. He thought of the flak pit again, traverse wheel under his palm, the way the muzzle blast slapped his cheeks, the magazine spring that stung his thumb. He had believed earnestly that a nation was the sum of its guns. Now he began to suspect another calculus, something measured by freezer doors that sealed tight, and a woman who knew the price of joy by line item and issued it at a window with a smile she didn't waste. The Coke left a wet ring on the counter. He capped it with his thumb to save a swallow for after retreat, a private ritual to anchor a day he knew would matter later. Mabel slid him a napkin, voice still procedural. "Don't drip on your sleeve, hun." He laughed at the tone, the strange kindness of standard operating procedure, and the corporal's mouth twitched like he was choking on a grin. Outside, the bugle call trembled, and the wind carried the smell of cut lumber from a work detail loading a truck. Kurt stepped into the light with both treasures and felt, not safety, not yet, but space to breathe. If someone asked what America was, he decided, he would answer with a taste. The cone's curl softened, a drop slid down and darkened the stenciled letters on his sleeve, PW. The spot faded quickly, the sweetness did not. Under a green-shaded lamp at the rail office, one Lieutenant Daniel "Danny" Cole initialed a requisition that always raised eyebrows. Dairy stock for PXS, including ice cream. Opposite his form lay an ordnance captain's demand for POWs shipments whose urgency was beyond debate. Danny didn't argue combat, he argued arithmetic, morale curves, compliance rates, sick call dips, all traced against shipments that hummed at 10 degrees Fahrenheit. In the scrape and clatter of the freight yard, he argued for space in a refrigerated boxcar as though it were a gun position. A conductor chalked symbols on steel, and cold vapour curled from a reefer door like a promise. Danny walked the line with his clipboard, the night smelling of creosote and diesel. He knew the numbers the way infantrymen knew the angles of fire. Compressor duty cycles, door open losses, BTUS, to hold a 10 by 20 freezer between 0 and 10. A corporal from the depot shop briefed him on a belt beginning to fray. The repair would wait until the consist reached the main depot. In the meantime, they would run a 2-on, 1-off routine to keep the motor cool. Ordinary heroism wore coveralls and listened to bearings with a screwdriver pressed to the ear. He had compiled the data into a short memorandum that had nearly gotten him laughed out of a conference room. Morale consumption tables, POW and troop. It looked like an artillery firing table with gentler nouns. Issue this much, see that result. He did not claim ice cream replaced discipline, only that it lubricated it, the way grease keeps a breech block from galling. After a month of comparative logs, the graphs spoke in a quiet staff voice. Incident rates down after sweetness days, work output steadier, guard details calmer. The colonel who had mocked the title wrote in the margin, "Continue." He watched the yard crew latch the reefer and feed a temperature probe through the gasket. The needle steadied. A yard bull cleared the track with a lantern's slow swing. Somewhere beyond the rails, barked cadence drifted from a training platoon. The American war machine did not distinguish between bullets and butter in the way that mattered most. Both were scheduled. He thought of the ridiculous sentences he had learned to say without flinching. "We must move 300 gallons by Thursday or discipline costs rise," and found he believed them because the ledger kept agreeing. From the depot refrigerator he went to the creamery that supplied the mix. Stainless piping ran like arteries. A foreman in a hairnet slid open a record book that could have served on any assembly line. Gallons, butterfat percentage, pasteurization temperature. The country had built a cold chain as deliberate as its war-making. It was no accident, it was culture carved into process. The foreman's daughter, Mabel, had answered a notice and now worked behind counters in places like Fort Lewis, issuing ordinary happiness at regulated intervals. The ordnance captain buttonholed him by the telegraph office, scowling at the reefer stenciling. "If that car delays my fuses, Cole, I'll have your bars." Danny nodded and pointed to the timetable. The consist would clear the junction 5 minutes ahead of the priority cars because cooler loads accelerated braking discipline. He had learned to speak in incentives that made railroad men nod. The captain grunted, more confused than convinced, and stalked off. Danny returned to the reefer, placed his palm on the chilled steel, and felt the hum through the bones of his hand. He thought of the men who would eat what he moved and the prisoners who would buy theirs with script they earned cutting timber or hauling crates. Law required parity, engineering made it possible, character kept it from slipping. A technician flagged him down at the panel, pointing to an amperage spike. They dropped the load for 90 seconds, swapped belts like a pit crew, and brought the compressor back online without losing a degree. When the line steadied, the tech wiped his hands and said, without bravado, "Good to go, sir." It was a phrase that could carry a corps across a continent. At midnight a whistle blew, and couplers slammed like doors in a long hallway. The reefer rolled, frost smoke drafting from the gasket, a pale banner trailing the car into the dark. Danny signed the last sheet and tucked the carbon under his clipboard. Some wars are won by men who never see the enemy, he thought. They fight tonnage and time, sabotage by entropy, ambush by heat. He took off his cap, wiped his forehead, and grinned despite himself. Somewhere, a boy would taste this shipment and make a decision about the world. The lamp buzzed, the yard settled. The ledger, faithful as a standard, waited for the next line he would write. Before the ship and the train and the PX floor, there was a trench of duckboards scraped by hobnails and a metal smell that never left the hands. Ruhr country, spring 1944. Sirens lifted. Searchlights found their slow white swords. 15-year-old Kurt Voss, Luftwaffe Flakhelfer, settled his shoulder into the shield and took the traverse wheel in his palm. The 2-centimetre Flak 38 spoke a language of clicks and springs that he knew as surely as he knew the names of the boys on his crew. A magazine slapped home, 20 rounds, then air and noise and light. He had been taught that scarcity purified and that purity would make them hard enough to outlast steel and fire. Rations tightened like belts. Sweets were a memory disguised as a smell from doorways. His sergeant measured everything: time on target, replacement barrels, the precious grease that kept the elevation screw from grinding. "Count, lads," the man would say. "War is counting." They counted to the clatter of empties in the tin can, to the beat of hearts they pretended were drums. When the tracers stitched up, he felt larger than his body. When they fell away, he felt cold and tired and old. Capture was not a moment, but a series of absences. An ammunition truck that did not arrive, a phone that did not ring, an order that did not come. Dawn found them with hands up and eyes full of grit, while American boots crunched the cinders. An MP with a carbine waved them toward a field cage and handed Kurt a stick of gum. The flavour, cheap and thrilling, was the first betrayal his fear suffered. On the second day, a medic cut his thumbnail short and painted iodine with a softness that irritated him because it made him want to sleep. The pipeline ran like a belt conveyor, cage to depot, depot to harbour, harbour to Liberty ship. The sea crossing was a slow amazement, coffee in tin mugs, a chaplain's service, sailors who argued baseball with the confidence of men who measured the world in seasons. He learned new numbers, meal times that arrived as if by clockwork, water temperature checked and logged, boots issued by size from crates that contained every size. He began to suspect the enemy was not merely strong, it was organized to make strength gentle when it chose. At Fort Lewis he discovered what abundance sounded like indoors: a fan with 3 tired clicks per turn, a compressor's hiss and clunk. In that soundscape, he felt a statistic before he would ever read it, that a nation could hold the temperature of kindness as precisely as it held an artillery quadrant. Later, he would learn the scale and blink at it. In 1944, America produced dairy on a scale that seems impossible. Tens of billions of kilograms of milk from a national herd, enough to make ice cream a routine issue item even while building fleets and armies. It was not bragged about. It was scheduled. When he first tasted PX ice cream, it was like a bomb going off without heat. The sweetness hurt. He swallowed and, against habit, closed his eyes. The world had instructed him to be hard. The flavour instructed him to be honest. He had believed the flaquet's rhythm was the nation's heart. Now another rhythm insisted on being counted. Deliveries on Tuesdays and Fridays, PX hours posted and kept, work details paying 50 cents per day in a script that could buy small joy on purpose. Memory spliced the two worlds. The traverse wheel hardened the palm in one place. The cone softened the same point. The sergeant's voice saying count, Mabel's voice saying, "Here you go, hon," which wasn't counting at all and somehow totalled more. The sky over the Ruhr, angry with searchlights, the low ceiling of a canteen speckled with dust and safe, as if safety could be routine. He had been told total war made boys into men. He began to understand that peace makes men into boys again for a minute, and that minute can move a history. At evening roll call, he saved the last warm swallow of Coke to mark the day. Then he slept a sleep that felt borrowed. He dreamed a mechanical dream, numbers churning, gauges steady, doors closing properly, where no one needed to shout to keep the machine running. In the morning, he woke hungry for schedules. It surprised him more than fear ever had. Mabel Hart pinned the Geneva summary to the corkboard with her thumb braced against the tack, the paper crisp and bilingual under her palm. The PX smelled of cardboard and wax and the ammonia bite of a clean floor. Behind the counter, the humming box held its line the way a good squad holds a trench. She had grown up near separators and brine tanks. Kindness to her had always sounded like a compressor settling into its proper register. The rules were not sentimental. Rations equal to US troops, access to the canteen, paid labour with script credited, law, not charity. First payday for the new arrivals fell on a Thursday, and the line formed in a hush like in church. A staff sergeant called names from a ledger, while an MP watched with the easy patience of a man whose rifle rarely has to speak. The boys, most of them really were boys, held the camp script as if it might evaporate. Mabel explained prices the way a clerk explains any inventory, then watched a sequence she would recognise in 100 faces: disbelief, calculation, and the tremble of choice. She kept her voice steady and ordinary. Extraordinary things should be issued plainly. A German non-commissioned officer with a parade ground moustache stepped to the counter and tried a speech about softness and corruption. He was not unkind, merely certain that this was a slope. Mabel pointed to the rules in his language and to the MP, whose hand remained off the pistol because everyone expected rules to do their own work. The NCO frowned at the cone rack as though it were a tactical problem. Behind him, a boy stared at a curl of vanilla the way infantrymen study the nearest cover. Mabel slid the boy a scoop with the precise motion of setting a cup of coffee on a workshop bench. Procedure defeated bluster not with force, but with habit. She had learned small tricks that technicians use. Keep the door closed as much as possible to preserve the cold and cut melt loss. Stagger deliveries so the unit never spikes. Rotate stock like ammunition, freshest to the back, oldest forward. It pleased her to imagine the PX as a weapon she could keep in good order. It pleased her more that the result was joy rather than blast. When the compressor hiccuped, she noted the cycle in a log and called for a belt before the belt failed. In war, you get ahead of problems, or problems get ahead of you. The boys began to come in on schedule, the way field hands come in at harvest, the way soldiers report to a firing line. The economy of chits taught a new discipline that did not have to hiss or slap. Work details filled because word spread that Thursday tasted better if Monday through Wednesday were steady. None of this was grand, it was granular. She saw it in the way shoulders dropped a notch when cooling air touched sunburned neck, in the way a laugh started at one end of the counter and travelled like a rumour you could believe. Once, on a hot afternoon, the moustached NCO returned and stood at the glass, watching a trembling 16-year-old try to decide. Mabel did not argue. She scooped, and he paid, and when he raised the cone to his mouth, the boy's eyes flicked to him for permission. The NCO tasted, blinked once, and nodded as if acknowledging a good shot. Doctrine meets detail, she thought, and detail wins because it shows up on time. She closed the till and wrote the day's tallies. Gallons issued, breakage near zero, incident log quiet. She had never been to the front. Her war had a ledger and a humming box and a queue that ended in small reliefs. It was enough. When retreat sounded and the bugle's voice folded through the open door, the compressor answered with its steady clatter. 2 rhythms, both necessary. She smoothed the Geneva page on the corkboard and pressed the tack hard with her thumb until the cork accepted it. Rules had to be set like that, firm enough to hold through weather. Danny's tour began at the creamery, where pipe ran bright as surgical steel and a glass gauge pulsed with pasteurized life. A foreman in a hairnet opened a ledger that looked like a Bible for mechanics: temps, run times, gallons, butterfat. He had learned to worship this kind of scripture, the kind that turns principle into practice. From there to the depot freezer, where frost furred the door gasket and a thermometer needle held its line at a number men had sweated and sworn to achieve. A technician showed him the belt they would swap on the next cycle, the teeth grained with the beginning of failure. The rail yard took the baton. A reefer stood coupled and humming, its door closed to keep heat ingress low. Danny checked the probe lead and signed the manifest while a conductor in denim wrote chalk on steel. The plan was as tidy as a map of a cause attack: departure, siding, junction, handoff. Every opening of a door was an artillery smoke mission, brief, necessary, controlled. He liked the way railmen measured time with lantern swings and the way the compressor men measured it with amperage. Parallel trades, both soldierly. He carried in his case the memo that had almost died of mockery: morale consumption tables, POW and troop. In the weeks since, it had acquired annexes, incident correlations, productivity deltas on work details, guard fatigue reports. Nothing certain, everything persuasive. The colonel who had scrawled continue now asked how many reefer slots he would require if the program scaled across his service command. Danny, who had once been shy with his own math, said the number without flinching and watched the ordnance captain wince as if those carloads would displace shells. They wouldn't. The timetable showed how to thread them. Cold cars clearing junctions 5 minutes early to improve braking discipline for the heavier trains behind. Sweetness, it turned out, could lead. At the camp storehouse, he checked the smaller chest freezer that bridged delivery to issue. The corporal on duty kept a door log with the neatness of a signalman's message book. Melt loss remained within tolerance. He nodded and signed, and the corporal said, "Sir, we scheduled unloads after chow, so the line's short." Less door time. Danny loved that sentence. It was the way Doctrine sounds when it goes native. He jotted a note to include the trick in the annex. He walked past the PX and saw the German boys move like anyone does when a day's work ends and a small reward beckons. For a moment, the war felt like a machine that, against precedent and probability, had learned a new function: mercy under power. He stopped at the board where Mabel had pinned Geneva. A wind from the parade ground fluttered the bottom corner, but the tacks held. He thought of how many miles these rules had to travel each week, and of the compressor hum that, to him, had become the sound of law keeping its word. Back at the depot, a minor emergency. Amperage spiked and the needle jittered. The tech cut load for a minute, swapped belts and a pulley, and the motor settled. No drama, just a cut and a stitch in the fabric where strain had shown. Danny initialed the repair log. The night shift foreman asked if the reefer still rolled. It did. The lantern swung. The coupler thudded. The car moved with its invisible cargo of future decisions made by boys tasting a flavour they had not been promised by the world that raised them. He filed his daily and walked into the rail yard dark with the knowledge that this too was a line of battle, entropy opposed by competence. Somewhere west, a barge in a far lagoon turned 10 gallons every 7 minutes. Somewhere east, a camp clerk counted chits and handed out routine happiness. He set his cap low and felt in the bones of the yard a nation making and keeping schedules. The ledger in his case creaked with carbon copies, each a little mirror of a system that believed in itself enough to write everything down. He smiled at the thought that tomorrow's entries would rhyme with today's. That was victory, measured not only in yards gained, but in degrees held. Ulithi Atoll, 1945. Rain slanted across the lagoon so hard it stitched the water into scales. CB2, Jack Red Malloy, CB electrician, hunched over a panel on a concrete barge that looked like a mislaid wharf and sounded like a cold storm trapped in a box. Generators thumped, brine tanks hissed, churns rolled their slow thunder. The deck gang had rigged windbreaks from canvas. Light bulbs made halos in spray. Red licked salt from his lip and watched an amp needle flirt with the red mark. If it climbed past, the churn would trip and thousands of future grins would melt into a lesson about maintenance. He eased a rheostat and called to the machinist mate to watch the brine temperature. "Hold her," he said, like men say to skittish horses and rumour. The barge was $1 million joke with a steel backbone punchline. Morale engineered at scale. It stored over 2,000 gallons and turned out 10 every 7 minutes when the sea behaved. Men bound for places with names that would bend the mouth, Okinawa, Hiroshima, lined the deck with mess cups like parishioners. Red loved their silence when the scoop hit the cup and the way the noise came back, layered with laughter, as if someone had declared a brief armistice. He had worked factory floors in peacetime. This plant made him feel like he had smuggled home into war and set it churning. A squall slapped the lagoon and the needles surged. Red felt it in his bones before the gauge spoke. He killed one generator, shifted load, and hot-wired a workaround with a length of wire he'd scrounged from a dead pump. The machinist mate cursed in admiration. The churn threatened to sulk, then found its rhythm. "Good girl," Red said, as he would to a bulky truck, and patted the casing. He could quote nothing elegant about democracy, but he could keep a promise between a machine and a schedule, and sometimes that's the same thing. He knew the ridiculous arithmetic because he had written it home like a brag he could defend. 10 gallons in 7 minutes, 8.5 an hour if the sea stayed kind. Enough cones for a destroyer's crew before sunset. In a single day, the barge could freeze more sweetness than some occupied towns had seen in all the war. The statistic sounded impossible until you stood with your hand on the casing and felt the hum talk through your bones. The plant taught its own lesson: abundance is a weapon if you know how to aim it. Sailors came up the gangway damp and quiet, clutching cups like spare parts. A boatswain's mate with Okinawa orders watched the churn the way gun crews watch a shell rack. "Never thought I'd see this out here," he said, almost apologising. Red checked the brine, nodded, and lifted the scoop. "Eat. It's regulation." The man laughed because it was true. In this war, kindness had a paragraph number. Between squalls, the lagoon showed its parade of silhouettes, carriers like cities, destroyers like greyhounds, tenders with cranes cocked like long fingers. The barge sat among them as humbly as a canteen truck in a motor pool, common as a wrench and as necessary. Photographers came once and took a picture of men grinning with cones, the horizon stitched with ships. Red hoped the negative wouldn't wash out in the damp. It seemed important for people at home to see that the country had learned to mass-produce a flavour in a typhoon. The machinist mate handed him a cup, and Red let himself sit on a coil of line under the lee of the canvas. The cold bit his teeth like a kid's winter dare. He tasted not victory. He would never use that word about his own work, but proof. Proof that the system which fed guns and planes could, when it chose, feed joy with the same remorseless competence. Another squall shouldered past. The amps held. The churn sang. He pictured a boy stateside reading Geneva on a corkboard and a clerk with a pin handing him a cone. He pictured the line forming here at dusk, men squinting against salt and rain, taking what was offered without shame because it had been engineered for them to have. At full dark, the fleet's lights came on, small cities afloat, and the barge's deck glowed like a diner at the world's edge. Red checked the log, signed his name, and wrote the output in a neat hand. Tomorrow he would pull the generator and change brushes before they insisted. Tonight he watched a destroyer slide past, men at the rail licking the last from their cups, and felt that rare mechanic's peace when everything that ought to hum, hums. The rain softened to a mist. The needle held steady in the good zone like a compass that had finally decided where north was. Texas, late summer 1944, and the road shook under the returning flatbed, its tailgate clanging like a loose hymn. The POW harvest detail rode him back among burlap sacks that smelled of dust and chlorophyll, boots nicked with the pale scars of maize. When the truck braked at the branch camp, a corporal jumped down and dropped the gate. The boys tensed, orders or punishment they couldn't know. Instead, the canvas lifted from a tub embedded in chipped ice, and the mess sergeant grinned with the pride of a battery commander unveiling a new gun. The barrel inside was scabbed with frost. The ladle flashed like a ramming staff. Someone said too loudly, "Ice cream," and then no one spoke at all. The supervisor had filed it as an incentive issue, a single line on a requisition, but the effect radiated beyond the ledger. Mabel would have called the trick procedural. Schedule the treat on the hottest days, stage dry ice in canvas-wrapped blocks, keep chest lid open time short so melt loss stays under 2%. In Danny's vocabulary, it sounded like a range card: reduce heat ingress, increase morale output, observe the curve. The boys didn't know these terms. They watched frost slide off the staves and clung to the edge of the truck bed like men at a rail before the home shore appears. The mess sergeant ran it like a range table, 1 scoop per man, neat, repeatable, without favoritism. Carl, birth year 1929, stamped on his paybook, reached the front and forgot the German word he wanted. Kurt took his cup, stepped aside, and the spoon clicked against tin with the rhythm of discipline turning kind. The guard by the gate wore his carbine low, then slung it as the line settled into a patient coil. The mustached NCO said nothing. He watched the ladle rise and fall, eyes set in the middle distance like any veteran witnessing a new drill that works. Later, after hands were rinsed at a Lister bag and the barrel scraped down to a syrup at the bottom, the supervisor made a pencil note in his pocketbook. Output on the detail had risen, 12% over the previous week's average, and tool breakage was down. The numbers were not science, they were evidence, sound enough for men who planned by feel. He scheduled the next barrel for a farm on the far side of the county and phoned ahead for an early reefer drop. The logistics were homely and exact. Dry ice would burn bare skin, gloved hands moved it without drama. The insulated tub had been scrounged from a dairy and recorked. At dawn, a reefer delivered the barrel in a cough of frost smoke, and the camp truck took it the last miles at a steady 30 so the ice wouldn't rattle thin. The mess sergeant kept the lid shut between squads like a captain keeping his powder dry. A curious private lifted it once and earned a look that would have quieted a mortar crew. Across the fence, civilian pickers waved. A farmer with sun-cracked lips traded a melon for 2 tin cups. No one called it propaganda. It was a barter of heat for relief, as old as summer. Boys trained to believe in hardness learned quicker from a spoon than from a sermon. They ate and then worked the last row with a smoothness no guard could have ordered. The NCO tucked his empty cup inside his belt like a ribbon he wasn't ready to wear. On the ride back, wind lifted chaff from the truck's wake like confetti blown from the wrong end of a parade. Kurt tapped his boot with the wooden spoon and tried to imagine the chain behind the barrel. Compressors holding the line, reefer doors swinging shut on a count, a clerk in a far office penciling figures that added up to flavour. Abundance did not swagger. It arrived with receipts. That evening the branch camp sounded like a farm after chores. An MP twirled his baton without thinking about it. The infirmary logged 2 fewer blisters than yesterday. The guard who usually barked counted instead, and the counting came out gentle. Mabel's ledgers in Washington would reflect the same pattern, town after town, week after week. She wouldn't write caused, only coincided, and underline the dates because accuracy is a form of honour. If any of it seemed implausible to Kurt, it was the scale, not the act. Barrels can be lifted by 2 men with grips and a grunt. Lids can be shut. Dry ice can be stacked like ammunition. The mile upon mile behind it, the junctions made on time, the BTUs balanced against the sun, the men moving quietly because the plan was loud, felt like a miracle rehearsed until it became ordinary. He finished the last of his ration bread with the last of the cold on his tongue and slept with the spoon in his pocket like a talisman carved from policy. The PX glass mirrored the moustached German NCO in hard slices, cones stacked like signal rounds beneath his reflection. Afternoon thunderheads sat over the cascades, the air inside cool as a chapel. Mabel felt the compressor settle into its good register and laid a sheet of wax paper on the counter the way a crew chief lays a rag on a cowl. The NCO planted his hands like a man bracing for recoil and declared in square parade ground German that boys were being softened into uselessness. He did not shout. He did not need to. Certainty is a quiet weapon. Mabel nodded as if he'd asked for a price, then turned her head toward the corkboard where the bilingual Geneva page curled at one corner. Rations equivalent to US soldiers, canteen access, paid labour credited as camp script. She recited them as naturally as a file number. The MP by the door watched the air between them, thumb resting on a leather loop, not the latch. A 16-year-old in line clenched his empty cup so hard his fingers blanched. Mabel did not ask permission from the sergeant or the boy or the law. She scooped around, turned her wrist, and set the cone down with a click. Next. The NCO's face made a small movement, irritation or hunger remembered. He glanced at the MP and found no enemy there, only procedure. "In my unit," he said, "we did not reward routine." Mabel thought of belts changed before failure, bearings greased before squeal, sailors fed before storms. "In my outfit," she said, "we do." He did not move aside. The boy behind him breathed too fast. Mabel made a second scoop and set it beside the first. "Someone is melting," she said with the voice mechanics use when a novice grips a wrench wrong. He lifted the cone as if it might bite him, took a cautious taste, and suffered the indignity of pleasure. A heartbeat passed. He nodded to no one in particular and stepped away. The line moved. The MP pretended to examine his fingernails. The boy with the white knuckles ate like a man reciting a prayer under mortar fire, small, sure mouthfuls. Kurt stood 3 places back, watching the sergeant's shoulders loosen the way a bolt backs off when friction finally gives. Mabel felt, as she often did, the odd power of ordinary gestures. She knew the chest's melt curve at this room temperature. She knew the price of a cone and the cost of a guard's overtime when tempers ran hot. She knew that every minute the door stayed open added heat ingress she'd have to pay back with compressor runtime, and she knew that the right minute spent now could buy quiet hours later. She was not sentimental about it. She kept a tallies sheet because numbers are how you remember the truth without arguing. By evening, the sergeant returned with his section and selected the smallest portion because dignity is a uniform you wear even after capture. He handed out cups like a communion of policy and custom. The boys slowed their chewing the way infantry slows a march when the ground turns to mud. Mabel watched their shoulders and believed the day would end without a sick call spike. The MP's posture shifted from watch to presence. The compressor hummed, obedient to meters and men. On her break, she read the memo Danny had circulated, consumption tables, POW and troop, and smiled at the bluntness. There were figures showing incident rates easing after issued deserts, and notes about door discipline cutting waste below 2%. It was not romance, it was arithmetic that favoured mercy. She taped the memo beside the Geneva page, and the 2 documents, a treaty and a table, looked to her like bookends that kept the same shelf from sagging. At lights out, a breeze came through the PX door and lifted the cone wrapper she'd set aside for the trash run. She caught it with 2 fingers, an easy snatch born of habit, and pinched it flat. Outside, the NCO walked the gravel lane like a man patrolling a memory of authority. He stopped at the edge of the barracks light, unwrapped a saved spoonful with the care of a field strip, and ate it alone. When he came in next time, he would still stand tall. He would also say, "Please." The ledger would never show that word, but veterans know where to look for victories. The conference room smelled faintly of chalk, coffee, and oiled map rollers. Pins marked depots and camps like a constellation. Strings showing reefer routes as arteries pulsing through a continent at war. Danny stacked his carbons, took a breath, and laid his figures down the way a gun captain calls ranges, clear, steady, deadly to doubt. Incidents per 1,000 prisoners of war, pre- and post-issue. Work detail productivity deltas. Guard overtime curves against heat waves. The colonel who had written "continue" months earlier rested his chin on steepled fingers and did not blink. Danny spoke in a language the room could trust. Melt loss under 2% when door open time averaged less than 8 seconds per transaction. Breakage rates trending to near zero once chest seals were replaced quarterly instead of as needed. Weekly gallons issued per head against disciplinary entries, a slope that even a skeptic's eye couldn't flatten. He didn't claim magic. He claimed maintenance of human systems with the same rigour the army applied to breech blocks and trucks. Behind him, the map waited like a range fan diagram, lines, angles, certainty priced in miles. The ordnance captain could not help himself. "We are discussing ice cream during a war." Danny nodded. "Yes, sir." "We are discussing morale as a supply item. We have tables for artillery. We should have tables for this." He let the silence run until the colonel lifted an eyebrow. "What's your scaling requirement?" Danny slid the annex. Reefer slots per service command, compressor spares, door log discipline notes, and a synchronization timetable that let cold cars clear junctions 5 minutes ahead to smooth braking for the heavy trains behind. Sweetness could lead. He kept his impossible statistic for last, the way a good sergeant keeps a surprise in reserve. A single concrete barge at Ulithi could churn 10 gallons every 7 minutes, 85 an hour if the sea behaved, and store over 2,000. In one 24-hour stretch, that plant could freeze more dessert than some occupied regions had allotted civilians in a month. Wartime records suggest as much, and the barge's logbooks did not lie. The colonel's mouth twitched. The faces around the table made the internal calculation all logisticians make, whether the numbers line up with what men see on the ground. Sailors had written home about cones on the eve of Okinawa. Camps from Washington to Texas had quieter nights on desert days. Correlation isn't doctrine. Repeated correlation becomes policy with a signature. The colonel signed. The rubber stamp thudded like a battery coming online. Authorizations followed like shells down a chute. Additional reefer slots, a compressor spare per depot, insulation repairs funded without the usual foot drag. Door discipline became a posted standard. Mabel wrote that phrase on her copy of the memo with an arrow. There is a joy in seeing your craft raised to doctrine. The ordnance captain shook Danny's hand in the hallway and muttered, "I still don't like it." Danny said, "Sir, you don't have to like what works." On his way out, Danny paused at the map. Lines glowed under the lamp, cold chain arteries feeding canteens, feeding letters home, feeding hours of quiet that could be spent on maintenance, training, rest. He thought of the way one system buttressed another. A guard who wasn't exhausted was a better shot if he ever had to be. A POW who felt seen needed fewer demonstrations of authority. A mechanic who could schedule instead of react would keep the trucks in the fight. He left the map room with a feeling that lives start looking like strategy when you draw them together. Back at the depot, he checked a belt they'd changed on schedule and ran a palm along the housing as if it were the flank of a horse. Somewhere, Red Malloy would be balancing amps against squalls. Somewhere else, Mabel would be catching a wrapper before it skittered off the counter and into the ledger as waste. Across the wire, a boy would look at a cone and think that rules kept tasted like this. Danny's pencil made one last note, approved expansion, effective immediately. The line on the page felt like a horizon. Letter hour in the barracks was a soft clatter of pencils, cot springs, and men deciding how much of the day to send across an ocean. Kurt wrote slowly in schoolbook German, careful with the words that would pass the censor's blade. "We have cold milk and a wind machine," he wrote, meaning the chest and the fan. "We work in fields and in timber. We are not hungry." He did not mention brand names or ice cream. He did not need to. His parents would read between the lines and feel something in their chests loosen where fear had coiled for years. Outside, the bugle called retreat and turned the yard briefly golden. The mustached NCO walked past with his section at ease, a cone in his hand held like an object lesson carried to term. He had not softened, he had accepted a rule he could respect because it was posted, translated, and kept. Nearby, an MP laughed at a joke about door discipline and spoiled product, the kind of joke men make when the machine runs and they can afford humour. Mabel finished tallying the day and added a note about a boy who had returned a cone when he thought he'd been overserved by a quarter inch. Integrity had a strange way of propagating when inventory was fair. Thousands of miles across salt water, Ulithi breathed in its own rhythm. CB2. Jack Red Malloy checked the brushes on a generator, the smell of hot varnish a kind of incense he'd learned to love. He wrote a line to his mother on stationery gone limp in the humidity. "We do 10 gallons in 7 minutes. Imagine the Ford line, but colder." He didn't explain what it meant to a sailor to hold a cup of sweet before boarding for a place named in briefings with a pointer and a frown. He didn't have to. Some truths ride their own ship. Weather carried its own doctrine that evening. In Washington, a marine layer crept in and cooled the PX like mercy you could forecast. In Texas, a heat lightning pulse made the dry ice sweat harder under burlap, and the mess sergeant kept the lid shut with the discipline of a man who had learned his craft in kitchens and on rifle ranges. In the lagoon, a squall shouldered past, and Red eased a rheostat as naturally as a helmsman trims a heading. Across these far points, gauges held where men willed them to, and that too tasted like a rule kept. The censor stamped Kurt's envelope. He addressed it to a town that might still be standing, or might be a sheet of cinders with a postman still keeping his bicycle, because that too was a rule. He pictured his mother's thumb on the paper, the way she would tilt her head at the phrase wind machine and smile, tired and honest. He pictured his father reading it twice and then folding it into his pocket because any piece of good news carried on a person, not left on a table. When lights were doused, a quiet like saneness settled. It would not last, not always, not in a world that had trained everyone to fear the knock on the door. But for an hour, the camp was governed by schedules and not by surprises. Kurt thought of the traverse wheel and the cone, of counting shells and counting door-open seconds, and he admitted, if only to himself, that this country had persuaded him by showing up on time with the right things cold. Red leaned against the warm casing and watched silhouettes slide across the lagoon, destroyers, tenders, big deck carriers that were cities with wakes. The churn hummed. He checked the output log and made a small correction where the machinist mate's pencil had smudged. It was nothing and everything, care practiced when no one is watching. Somewhere, a sailor who would see Okinawa at dawn licked the last sweetness from a cup and felt less alone. Somewhere, a boy in a barracks smiled into darkness and forgave himself for enjoying anything. The hour ended, and both men returned to their stations. The machine, moral and mechanical, kept time for them. The flag outside the Service Command headquarters fought a gust off Puget Sound, while Danny turned pages in a ledger that had grown thick with carbons. Columns of dairy, confection, incident decline, and reefer uptime formed a portrait more convincing than rhetoric. He noted respectfully that the United States now housed roughly 372,000 German POWs across more than 500 camps, and that in his district alone, weekly dairy issuance had scaled without an uptick in waste or discipline trouble. Numbers are not kind, he thought. They simply side with those who keep promises. Mabel arrived with tallies from the PX network, envelopes labelled in a neat hand that could have closed a bank. Door open averages under 8 seconds. Melt loss below 2% on hot days, below 1% on cool. Script redemption trending towards sweets on paydays and coffee on Sundays. She did not claim to know why. She simply reported. Danny added her figures to the annex he was building for peacetime. The cold chain as civilian inheritance. If we can do this under blackout and ration, imagine the grocery aisle when the lights stay on. Telephone coils carried voices from places now weighted with future history. A quartermaster major from the 8th Service Command asked for the insulation spec that had cut waste in Washington. Danny read it out, feeling the quiet fellowship of men who measure the same world. A Navy supply officer from an air station shared the trick of shifting cold cars ahead of gun cars to improve braking discipline on the grade out of the yards. Their sentences braided across branches because supply language respects rank but obeys physics. The ordnance captain, now an ally he would tease for the rest of his life, rapped a knuckle on Danny's doorframe and said, "Don't make me like this too much." Danny grinned and slid him a card stamped approved. The captain took it like a man accepting that the enemy of his enemy might be dessert. Out on the parade ground, an MP leaned his baton against a boot and glanced at his watch, the guard's own consumption table for the end of shift. Down the corridor, a chaplain rehearsed a VE Day service he hadn't yet been authorized to give. The prayer in his mouth carried the flavor of supply, thanks for bread that arrives, for ships that keep their screws, for trains that make the next town on schedule. Danny closed the ledger and felt, not triumph, but a stillness that belongs to craftspeople who know they have kept the machine honest. He thought of the barge at Ulithi, of Red Malloy's hand on a casing warm as a stovetop, and the hum that said the amperage was right. He drafted a memo that would outlive him. Morale logistics to be treated as doctrine, not miracle. He listed spares, training, door discipline, and a note on the unexpected diplomacy of fair issue. He wrote that boys who bought cones with money earned at work details often returned for seconds in steadier spirits than those who received charity. Democracy makes a better commissary than a throne, he added in pencil, then erased the line because it sounded like a speech and he preferred tables. When he stepped outside, the flag snapped and cracked like canvas in a squall, then settled. In the distance, barracks windows made a comb of light, and a truck rattled past with a reefer's breath steaming from its joints. He thought about the post-war shelves Americans would build, the refrigerated trucks that would hum through peacetime neighborhoods, the oaths men would keep to each other without bugles because they had learned to be on time. The guard at the gate saluted with a small smile that said the night would be an easy one. Danny returned it and went back in to sharpen his pencil. There were still lines to draw between the sweetness and the steel. Spring 1945 leaned into summer with a softness the war did not deserve. At Fort Lewis, cherry blossoms sluiced across the gravel yard and stuck to damp boots. Kurt stepped out of the PX with 2 cones and handed one to the moustached NCO without ceremony. The older man accepted it as he would a ration after a long march, nodded once and stood in the mild, as if learning how to occupy peace a few minutes at a time. On the corkboard, Geneva fluttered beside Danny's consumption tables, law and arithmetic raised together like a colour guard. In the lagoon at Ulithi, Red Malloy shut down a generator to change brushes and felt the barge's deck thrum with the diminished heartbeat of industry at rest. He could still hear the line singing through the concrete, the way a sleeping dog's paws twitch with remembered running. He cleaned carbon dust from under his nails and looked up at carriers big enough to own their own weather. By the time he brought the plant back online, the churns would catch the beat again, 10 gallons every 7 minutes, storage past 2,000, a small town's festival in cold waiting. Numbers, properly placed, can feel like parables. By mid-war, Willow Run could roll a B-24 off the line roughly every hour at peak, and American yards launched Liberty ships in what seemed like a long weekend's rhythm. Against that backdrop, a floating dessert factory sounds like a prank until you stand on its deck in a squall and feel the hum. A nation that could bend steel to bombers by the hour chose also to bend ammonia and brine to cones for sailors. It would be wrong to say sweetness won the war. It would be right to say abundance, disciplined and democratic, made victory inevitable the moment it learned to keep time. Repatriation would take years. Trains would carry boys back to towns missing bridges and fathers. Kitchens would relearn heat that wasn't rationed. Kurt, who had once cranked a traverse wheel under searchlights, found himself drawn to the walk-in box behind the PX and to the ordinary religion of keeping the dial between 0 and 10. He asked Mabel for every chore that touched the chest, then asked Danny where a man might learn refrigeration proper. There was no romance in the answer, only a school and a union card, and a country that loved schedules more than speeches. He would take that home one day. Peace has to be installed. On the pier, Red watched sailors spoon the last from cups and pass them down the line for washing. He thought of men who would not come back and felt the complicated pride of someone whose craft had steadied hands that did. He wrote one more letter. We kept the plant running. Tell Dad I used his trick with the belt when the rain came sideways. He did not mention the moment he saw a Marine close his eyes to take a second taste, as if memorizing cold for later. Some liturgies are private. Danny turned in his final spring ledger and added a postscript, hand-lettered, treat morale as a supply item. He did not lobby for monuments. He wanted spares in bins, techs trained, tacks driven hard into cork so rules did not flutter loose. He walked the PX one last time and watched a clerk who could have been Mabel hand a cone to a boy who could have been an enemy a month earlier, both of them disciplined by lines and laughing anyway. He imagined the grocery aisles of the future, fluorescent, overfull, indifferent in the best possible way. The last image is simple. A drip wanders down the paper and darkens the stenciled PW on a sleeve, then vanishes. The taste stays. The boy who was trained for scarcity has learned a different math. The sergeant who believed hardness was the only virtue has found another that wears no medals. The mechanic who never fired a shot measures his success in hums per minute. The officer who argued for reefer slots feels the right kind of small before the map, where his lines run like veins. America did not merely outshoot its enemy. It outscheduled an empire of brutality, outproduced its myths, and proved, cone by cone, that a free people can weaponize kindness without apology. The machine winds down. The promise remains.